Okay. So Mikhail Bakunin, he was a Russian anarchist. He was first born in a town that I can't pronounce the name. It starts with a P. It was in May 30 of 1814. And he died July 1st of 1876 in Bern, Switzerland, when he was only 62. This was his early death was attributed to his years spent in Russian prisons, which were horrible and gave him basically really, really bad health. So his early development at 14, he goes to artillery school, and he leaves there, and then he goes to Moscow to study philosophy at the age of 21 against his father's wishes. He was born to a noble family of landowners in Russia, and so he kind of goes basically against what his father's wishes were. While he's studying philosophy in Moscow, he actually starts to get into Hegel and provided some of the first translations of Hegel into Russian. In 1840, he goes to Berlin and then to Dresden a few years later. In Dresden, there was an insurrection uprising in 1849, which he was a big part of. When the Russian government found out that he was becoming extremely radical, what they did is they took away all of his possessions in Russia because he would not come back to Russia to stop his radicalism all over Europe. But in 1844, he goes to Paris, where he's in contact with Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Karl Marx, and that's where he really starts to develop his revolutionary ideas. Again, he participated in the Dresden Uprising in 1849. Notable people were Richard Wagner, who's a really great classical artist, and then also Wilhelm Heine. I don't really know particularly what he did, but he got captured in Dresden and was sentenced to life imprisonment by the Russian authorities, by the Austro-Hungarian authorities. Basically, everyone hated him and wanted him killed, but they ended up just giving him life imprisonment in Russia. And this was in 1851. So he goes to prison for 8 years in the famous prison of Peter Paul prison. I don't know. It was famous. He was there for 8 years. He got out because his cousin was a prince. And so his prince appealed to the Tsar of Russia, and also his mother appealed to him to get him out. And so what it did is they allowed him to come out of prison and to work for his cousin in Siberia. In 1861, though, he escapes via Japan and then to the United States, and then he makes his way back to Europe, which is pretty awesome. Ultimately, though, he does move to Italy in 1861, and he immerses himself in any of the revolutions that go on. So he was in the Poland uprising. He was in a Lion uprising, which is outside of Paris, in 1870. And then in 1871, they had the Paris Commune. In 1868, though, he joins the First International with Karl Marx and everything else. He was part of a group called the Social Democracy Alliance. And what it was an international group with a bunch of different nationalism from Spain, Italy, Greece, all these different kinds of anarchist groups all together into this one Social Democracy Alliance, which was an international group. The First International rejected them and said that they could not come as a whole group of international because this was an international group too. And so they made them break up into their own nationalistic groups. But he got kicked out of the First International in 1872 by basically Karl Marx, and his supporters got voted out. They were the minority party. And so he starts another international, which was called the Black International in Switzerland in 1872. Nothing really happens or develops after that within the Black International. But he ends up retiring in 1873, so a year after he gets kicked out of the International, and he goes to Switzerland and he retires, and he basically says, I don't have enough energy or willpower to fight for the revolution anymore. I'm retiring. And so he retires for 30 years and then he dies. I believe there was already a talk on his life, so that's why I kind of gave a really brief glimpse over it. So I would rather more focus on his ideals and what he talked about. So his biggest advocacy was for anarcho collectivism. Anarcho collectivism is different from anarcho communism in the sense that anarcho collectivism still believes in a wage system. What will happen is that the means of production will be collectively owned, controlled, and managed by the producers or workers. And so what will happen is each worker will be paid according to what the work that he has done. So before this, the revolution occurs where workers take control of everything and they collectivize everything. But not everything, but they collectivize, what is it called? Not qualitative, but property that is used for the means of production. That's what they collectivize. And so not your books, not your individual clothes. Those kind of things are not collectivized. Those are still your own personal property. And that's what they considered only personal property. They didn't consider property houses, those kind of things. So they set up a salary or a wage system, which would be set up by the different democratic councils that were part of the unions and part of the different corporations, and set up these democratic councils from the workers to determine the pay of each worker. And then this wage will be able to be used in a communal market where all of the different products are there. And so you can say, hey, I want to buy an hour's worth of tobacco, or I want to buy, a toothbrush for 15 minutes of my work. So the difference between anarcho-communism is that the goods are distributed according to how much you work and how much you put in versus what your needs are. So that's a brief synthesis of anarcho-collectivism. He also believed in federalism, federalism being more of going from the bottom up. And so a decentralization of groups organized from the bottom up, starting with the individual person, and then they go into associations, and those associations form into communes, and the communes form into regions, and then those regions form into nations. And so everyone has the choice to associate or not, can do it with whomever they please. So on the very initial basis is you have the individual. And so the individual, if he wants to associate with someone, they can associate, make an association, move into a commune. But at any point, if that individual feels like it's not going for him, they can obviously opt out of that. So that was his basis for federalism. He was also very anti-God, anti-religion, extremely. One really good quote is, he says, "The idea of God implies the abdication of human reason and justice as the most decisive negation of human liberty and necessarily ends in the enslavement of mankind in theory and practice." And that was in God and the State in 1882, so after he was died, or after he died. So basically he believed that what God was is that he was just like the state and that he controlled everything, and that especially religion and church, the controlling power of those forces is just the same as the state. And so I believe it's Voltaire, it might be Voltaire. It started with a V.
Voltaire's the anarchist writer.
Okay, so it's Voltaire then. Voltaire said that if God didn't exist, we would have to create him. Bakunin switched it, and he said if God existed, we would have to destroy him. So, it's a bit different. He also advocated for propaganda of the deed, to a letter to a Frenchman on the present crisis in 1870. So this was during the Lyons the Lions Uprising in 1870, right before the Paris Commune, which was in March and May of 1871. He says, "We must spread our principles not with words but with deeds, for this is the most popular, the most potent, and the most irresistible form of propaganda." So he gave rise to insurrectionary anarchism, which is basically, some would say terrorism, some would say very individualist, in that it's one person committing either an assassin or one person exploding a bomb, not a specific set group. There were some pretty famous insurrectionary anarchists, both Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. He wrote the ABCs to Anarchism. He tried to kill Henry Clay Frick, an industrialist who killed several union members, and that was in 1892. Also, Enrico Malatesta and Luigi Gallieni. Luigi Gallieni, his followers were actually, some of them were Sacco and Vanzetti, two anarchists that were in the Boston area that got tried, not for their anarchists, or not for what they did necessarily, but for their anarchist principles, and because they were linked to this insurrectionary group. But that's a totally different story. He was also, Bakunin was also a very, very big person against Marx. It was said that that Marx, his analysis of economics was very, very great. He was really impressed with it a lot, and he actually started to translate Das Kapital into Russia, but he didn't finish it. But he definitely was against Marxist idea of state socialism, especially because he was vehemently against the state. There's a quote in his lecture called Statism and Anarchism, and it says, they, the Marxists, maintain that only a dictatorship, their dictatorship of course, can create the will of the people, while our answer is to this: no dictatorship can have any other aim but that of self-perpetuation, and it can beget only slavery and the people tolerating it. Freedom can be created only by freedom. That is, by a universal rebellion on the part of the people and free organization of the toiling masses from the bottom up. And so they obviously rejected the dictatorship of the proletariat, taking control of the state apparatus and basically eventually getting to communism. Some critiques of Bakunin. In his earlier years, he advocated what was called an invisible dictatorship. It was a letter to Albert Richard, who was also in the Social Democratic Alliance. And he says, there is only one power and one dictatorship whose organization is salutary and feasible. It is that collective, invisible dictatorship of those who are allied in the name of our principle. This dictatorship will be all the more salutary and effective for not being dressed up in any official power or extrinsic character. This was in 1848, I believe. But it was early on when he was still developing his ideas. And basically what that meant is that he advocated for a group of revolutionaries not to have any power in any of the groups, not to have any go for political office, not to go for even unionist offices. What it is just a group of revolutionaries that are dedicated to the principles of anarchy and socialism, and that they push forward the revolution in a way that would be beneficial. In defense, Bakunin was still developing his ideas again, and so he totally rejected this in 1866. As he writes, he says, "We are the most pronounced enemies of every sort of official power, even if it is an ultra-revolutionary power. We are the enemies of any sort of publicly declared dictatorship. We are social revolutionary anarchists. But you will ask, if we are anarchists, by what right do we want to influence the people and what methods will we use? denouncing all power with what sort of power, or rather by what sort of force shall we direct a people's revolution? And he says, by a force that is invisible, that no one admits, and that is not imposed on anyone, by the collective dictatorship of our organization, which will be all the greater the more it remains unseen and undeclared, the more it is deprived of all official rights and significances. Secret organizations would finally have the strength of that close solidarity which binds isolated groups in one organic whole. These groups would not seek anything for themselves, and they would be in a position to direct popular movements. This is what I call the collective dictatorship of a secret organization. And so that came in 1866, and that was a letter to a Russian friend named Sergei Nechayev. Sure. So basically, my personal thought on this is that he was still developing his ideas. So, yeah, he did say for an invisible dictatorship, but he definitely changed, and the way that he put forth his efforts was that not for an invisible dictatorship. He also put forth his efforts in open revolution. And so, yeah. He was also a nationalist. He believed, especially in the Slavs, the Slavic people, and participated in several other different councils and whatnot. The Slavic people are more of Eastern European, like Ukrainians and those kind of things. So that could be a fault, especially in the wider range of anarchism, in that nationalism creates people wanting to help their national government. Nationalism is something that a lot of people can't avoid. I mean, we were born in the United States. We're, U.S. citizens. And at least when we have been raised, we've been raised to love the United States, to, we have the 4th of July, we have flag waving, we have parades and everything else. And so if nationalism is based in our, we were raised on it. And so for him to support nationalist struggles, and for him to support nationalism, in my view, is kind of obviously in the greater anarchist tradition of we want everyone to become anarchist, not just one specific people, but we want the whole world to create a anarchist society, and so it's not going to be just one nation. And so when you focus on just one nation, then you have nations pitting against each other, and which is not what we want. We want nations working together. Another criticism of his is that he was a pretty big anti-Semite. And to be honest, the only thing that I've come up with that maybe can actually, you know what, there's really no reason for him to be an anti-Semite other than the fact that Marx was a Jew, and he considered the German people. This is what he believed, is that the German people, and especially state socialism, was going to be run by a centralized bank, and because banks were owned by Jews, then the Jews would be controlling the banks, and so they would be controlling state socialism. That was his reasoning for being an anti-Semite. Obviously, I don't agree with that at all. Like, that's just bogus. But that, yeah. So he was an anti-Semite. But a critique of anarcho collectivism by actually Peter Kropotkin in The Conquest of Bread, in his chapter 13, actually titled, it was an essay that he said, The Collectivist Wage System. Peter Kropotkin was an anarcho-communist, and so obviously a little bit different, because the communists, as before, believed in giving according to your need rather than what work you have put in, which would be the wage system of anarcho-collectivism. So Peter Kropotkin, he says, it amounts to this: everybody works in field, factory, school, hospital, etc. This is talking about anarcho collectivism. The working day is fixed by the state, which owns land, factories, road, etc. Every working day is paid for with a labor note, which is inscribed with these words: 8 hours worked. With this check, the worker can procure all sorts of merchandise in the stores owned by the state or by diverse corporations. The check is divisible so that you can buy an hour's work worth of meat, 10 minutes worth of matches, or half-hour tobacco. After the collectivist revolution, instead of saying 2 pence worth of soap, we'll say 5 minutes worth of soap. He goes on to say, most collectivists, true to the distinction laid down by middle-class economists and by Marx between qualified work